As I mentioned, welcome. Thank you for being here for NCST's February Community Impact Briefing. My name is Raquel Reddy, Vice President of Community Development here at NCST, and we have got just an amazing presentation today talking about middle neighborhoods, but the evolutionary tale of middle neighborhoods in Baltimore. So really excited to present our data and our mapping today, as well as having some just contextual dialogue with our presenters. So I do want to introduce Kristopher Hoff, as well as Bob Pipik, and also my other colleague, Emmy McClintock, who is filling in for Elizabeth Coates today to do our policy towards the end of our call. But thank you again. We are going to ask you to provide any questions, your Q&A, and any chats throughout the presentation, but we will actually get to it at the end. So just a little bit of housekeeping there. And we're going to go ahead and get ready and just share with you a little bit about our work in looking at a time series data set that Kristopher Hoff will definitely tell you a little bit more about to show what middle neighborhoods have looked like and what remains the same, what's changing in Baltimore. And with that, I would like to formally introduce Kristopher Hoff and Bob Pipik. So with that, let me just introduce them very quickly to you. Kristopher Hoff has worked at NCST in a variety of roles since 2012 and currently holds the title of Research and Policy Analyst. Chris holds a BS in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Minnesota, an MS in Civil Engineering from Minnesota's College of Science and Engineering, and a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. So Chris, thank you for joining us today. And Robert or Bob Pipik is also here today with us and currently holds the position of President and Chief Executive Officer of Healthy Neighborhoods, Inc. Prior to joining Healthy Neighborhoods in 2022, Bob held senior level positions with the City of Baltimore's Department of Housing and Community Development, as well as the city's Research and Strategic Planning Department. Bob's past experience also includes Chief Operating Officer of the Equio Fund, a philanthropic real estate investment fund based in Baltimore. Bob received a master's degree in city and urban community and regional planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree from Columbia University. So thank you both for being here. Very excited to hear more about your presentation, and I believe it's already up. So everybody will take a look at it and give you an opportunity to share the latest. So Chris and Bob, please feel free.
Okay, thank you very much, Raquel, and welcome, Bob. We'll start out with some background, talking about middle neighborhoods very briefly. Middle neighborhoods are neighborhoods that are neither clearly healthy and thriving nor overtly distressed. So we are roughly defining them today as between 80 and 120% of the city median income. So that's the median income of the city of Baltimore, not the greater metro area. Middle neighborhoods are often middle or working class. They're often referred to in that way. NCST is the home of the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, which is a national initiative advocating for policy and practice for these middle neighborhoods. And you can find more information at the link on this page. The data set we'll be using today was developed by researchers at Brown University. It's called their Longitudinal Tract Database. They present public use tract level data, and they normalize it all to census tract boundaries from the 2010 United States Census. So this makes it more comparable over time. It's also a very good source for old census data that we can then map and analyze without having to pull it out of books and whatnot, as it's hasn't necessarily been digitized back to those days. When I say that they are all on the same census tract boundaries, here's a quick peek at the mapping of middle neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore. So I'm sure you all recognize the shape of the city of Baltimore. These are one map for each of our time periods. So starting in the top left, 1970 census, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and also the most recent we have labeled as 2020. But that data only goes up to 2019, and we don't include any data from the pandemic year in this presentation. Very quickly, the dark blue or gray areas of the city that you see are middle neighborhoods. So those are between 80 and 120% of the city median income. and they are majority white neighborhoods. The orange color is majority black middle neighborhoods, and the yellow color that you see on some of the more recent maps especially are what we're going to refer to as mixed middles, and those are middle neighborhoods in which there is no majority racial or ethnic demographic. So they would be more diverse, and they've been, as you can see, they've been emerging more over time. Really quickly before we move off this slide, one of the big trends that we'll be referring back to is the changing demographics of the city of Baltimore, and it's illustrated here in that you can see many white majority middle neighborhoods the further back in time you go, and there are very few in the most recent data that we have, and they have not necessarily been supplanted by black middle neighborhoods, although we have seen an increase in the number of black middle neighborhoods. But this, this white flight from middle neighborhoods also, mirrors what we know that we've seen for the city as a whole over this time period as well.
So, Chris, and thank you, Raquel, for that introduction. And Chris, I think that the main trend that's pretty obvious here is the sort of exit of those gray census tracts from the maps over time. I expect most people on this call are pretty familiar with the story of what is sometimes called white flight. I do think sometimes there's a perception that, it was the wealthiest residents leaving. And, I think when we begin to look at this tranche of data, we realize that it was either equally across economic spectrum or perhaps more predominant in the middle class. The orange, by the way, is quite the Rorschach test. I spent a lot of time looking at maps of Baltimore, and it's very hard to interpret the if you go back when the orange, which is the majority black middle tract neighborhoods. I think this is where we can use our data to sort of dig in and see what's going on.
So we'll look at some really high-level data to begin with. This chart on the left shows the total number of tracts in the city of Baltimore, which is roughly 200 for this data. And it's split into the blue bars, which are higher income tracts, so those would be greater than 120%. The reds are the low income tracts, and the green ones are our middle tracts. And so I think the first thing that we notice is that in the 1970 census and going forward, really until the past 20 years, there have been more middle income census tracts in the city of Baltimore than any other type. And they have been declining over time. And now you're even seeing low income tracts being the predominant type of income tract that we see in the city of Baltimore. Although I will say that this bump in middle from 2010 to 2020, from 63 to 69 is perhaps, we talked about it previously, Bob, and maybe that's a source of optimism in that we are seeing a bounce back in some of these middle income tracts. The chart on the right takes that green bar and then splits it into the demographic categories that make it up. So this navy blue or gray part of the bar counts the majority white middle tracts, and the orange part counts the majority black middle tracts, and then the yellow are our mixed middles. And as you can see, the number of majority white middle tracts has declined substantially. And it has not been made up by the increase in the number of black middle tracts. Although we did see an increase in black middle tracts, but I know that, you noted this right away, Bob, is the number, over the last 20 to 25 years is actually remarkably consistent.
There's a couple of things that really stick out for me on these two charts. First of all, it feels like, 1970 through 2010. Okay, that's a story that people in our professions kind of know. What's happened since then is a lot harder to interpret, and I feel like this is where our data may be able to help us, and hopefully our colleagues on the call. The decline in the green bar or the height of the bars on the right is evident in the sort of height of deindustrialization, if you will, and suburban flight. But in the last 20 years, as those two trends are really not abating, there has been this leveling off, and in some cases, maybe an uptick. So it's a little hard to know immediately what to make of it. And I'll admit the 2020 data on the left chart, that's pretty stark, that it's really the first time that the red bar, the lowest income communities, which is the number of tracts for whom the median income and the city level is below 80%, is notably higher than the others. And there's a pretty steep stair step as a result of that decline in the blue bar, which is the more wealthy neighborhoods. And so, I keep going back and forth over the course of this data between, senses of optimisms and leveling off. And now we're kind of moving into, we sort of swallowed a lot of the population loss, and land use patterns are adjusting in the markets, and sources of concern like, the drop in that blue bar, it's pretty steep decline in the number of wealthier census tracts by count. And I think I was surprised to see it, and it does kind of correspond with the tale of, cities are becoming places for the rich and the poor. But let's keep going.
So this next set of tracks is, or this next set of charts, I should say, we are going to, what we're looking at is the average demographics of all city tracts on the left side. So this is the average value. So taking all the city tracts, and we'll take the average number of white percentage and the average number of black percentage and the other demographic values, and then put them on this chart. So this is your average city tract. And as you can see, I mean, it's the same story that we've been talking about. This dark blue or this gray line of the percentage of white residents is declining. And we know that, and the percentage of black residents is increasing over time. And we see that trend, and we're aware of that trend. So the chart on the right is showing that breakdown, but for all middle income tracts. And as you can see, the lines are steeper. So the trend that we are looking at in the city, if anything, we're seeing it exacerbated in our middle tracts, in that we're seeing a steeper decline in white population and a steeper increase in black population over time. And we talked about white flight very briefly, and these middle class white middle income tracts, they're moving to the suburbs. For the most part, I think that there's probably a larger paper and there's a larger analysis to be done, but they're leaving the city, and we're seeing an increase of them in the suburbs as well. So that's kind of the story we're looking at. We also have charts for our middle tracts broken down to look at only our black middle census tracts and only our white middle census tracts. And so, the things that stick out here are, one, our black middle census tracts are very black. They are high percentage of black population, and although we're seeing a slight decline, there's not really a big shift in demographics over time. Whereas our white middle census tracts, we are seeing a shift in demographics. They're becoming, while the black middle tracts are staying segregated, the white middle tracts are not necessarily that way. And part of that is the decline in the overall white population. But we're seeing those white middle tracts not being as overwhelmingly white as the black middle tracts are overwhelmingly black.
Yeah, I think that the chart on the right is really pretty interesting. And, on the sources of optimism side, There are a number of census tracts that are just much more racially integrated over the last 20 years than that had previously been the case. Now, Baltimore, like many cities, I'm sure represented in the group here today, has a history of segregation that lives with us to this day. And the chart on the left, I think, is pretty strongly representative of that. But in some ways, the one on the right, like we see the rise in populations that are mixed either, by various definitions and are somewhat small by national standards, but not insignificant growth in the Latinx population. So what's interesting is if we think into the future and what the 2030 chart will look like, it probably loses some of the very few remaining white majority middle class tracts. And but I do think there will be more and more tracks that are becoming more integrated.
Right, and we did look briefly at the rise in kind of these mixed middles in which there isn't a majority demographic, and so those would be kind of the most integrated census tracts, and they're in small numbers right now, but we do see them growing. I'll move on.
There's more of them than there are white middle income.
That's right.
tracts.
Yes, that's right. And the white tracts are more diverse demographically as well, so they're probably somewhat comparable. So looking at the slide, we're looking at the age distribution across all tracts, and we won't spend a lot of time here, but we can see that there's a trend of decreasing young population, so that would be under the age of 18, and an mildly increasing aged population that would be greater than the age of 60, and an increasing kind of working age population. That's the red bar at the top. And so on the left, we're looking at the entire city as a whole. But if we want to compare that to our Black middle tracts, we're seeing a lot, we're seeing the same trends, but they're steeper lines. In 1970, we're looking at 40% of Black middle tracts were under the age of 18, which is a huge number, and a very low age population. And those have kind of converged. And now those Black middle tracts look more like the city as a whole in terms of its age distribution, as opposed to in 1970, in which they really didn't.
And the slope of the green line on the right, meaning the increase of the proportion of residents in Black middle tracts who are over the age of 60, is pretty stark. And to me, that green line and blue line converging resonates with the story we have locally about, well, first of all, there's families are getting smaller, so that's an issue across our country for the most part. But secondly, there's a concern in a lot of our middle class neighborhoods about the flight of Black families in particular. And when we look at census tracts that are losing population more steeply, those are places that really kind of stand out, places that had 30, 40 years ago high proportions of Black, families, larger families. The other thing here that I'm beginning to wonder is about seniors kind of aging in place over time. And, one of the uses of data is to kick off the use of more data to answer the next question that you have. And, begin to wonder, we're looking at these tracks as these snapshots. But, another analysis might be, well, how many of these tracks are leaving the status of middle and going up or going down, and how many are coming up and how many are coming down, right? So there's a fair amount of churn, as we saw in the maps. They kind of go all over the place. And this age slide really began me thinking about communities that either quantitatively or anecdotally, we know there to be large proportions of seniors aging in place. And are they sort of being swept up into this middle category, partially as a result of their static incomes and not necessarily being traditional working class communities that we might otherwise think is what's in this category.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you, Bob. So I'll move on to the next slide. Really getting into well, why don't I explain what we're looking at here, because there's a lot of colors. We'll look at the chart on the left. This is the average median home value. So we take all the tracts in the city and take the average median home value across those, and that's what gives us this green line. This green line is the average median home value of all tracts in the city. The gray line below it is the average median home value of all of our middle tracts. So it's slightly lower, but not greatly so across the board. And the bars show us our middle tracts broken down by racial demographic. So once again, the navy are white middle tracts, the orange are black middle tracts, and the yellow are mixed middles. And these are all normalized to 2019 dollars. So you can see that the median home value, as I'm sure nobody is surprised, spikes between 2000 and 2010, which when we had our mortgage crisis. And then it has come down actually in the 10 years after that, interestingly enough. And you know, there's a lot to unpack here. We're seeing, you know, kind of persistently higher home values in white middle neighborhoods as opposed to black middle neighborhoods. And we're also kind of seeing persistently higher home values in the city as a whole, even as we're seeing a rise in low income neighborhoods at the expense of high income neighborhoods. Our chart on the right is all the exact same things, except what we're looking at is median household income, also normalized to 2019 dollars. And as you can see, it's fairly flat. It hasn't really changed in the last 50 years, both you know, for the city as a whole, middle neighborhoods as a whole, and really the various racial demographics. So, you know, similar story to things we've seen elsewhere is a spike in home prices without really any change in household income.
Yeah, I really found this interesting. And as you point out, if you take a squint in and look hard at the 1970 versus 2020 data for the median income, they are very close to each other. Like you know, if we took out everything in the middle, you would think it's a flat line. You know, that's a pretty humbling realization that, you know, if you think of it in these terms, within the city limits, the middle income population suffered a drop in income and spent the last 40 years clawing their way back to where they were in 1970. It also is worth mentioning, and we're not looking at area median income, but you know, Baltimore's city median income in comparison to the regional value is declined in each of these periods, right? They were relatively close together 50 years ago, and now it's I don't know, maybe 60% of the city's value is maybe 60% of the area median value. So, you know, one of the issues here to think about, and for our organization, and we work in these middle communities, and we know our buyers, we do a mortgage product, among other things. Our borrowers and buyers have choices. They can move other places in the city, and this is a little demonstration of many of them doing so in this series of data. But you know, the neighborhoods here are actually, you know, becoming poorer, even though that we still think of them as the middle, you know, but in the regional context, you know, the neighborhoods are becoming poorer over time. And then comparing the charts is kind of fascinating. The run up between 2000 and 2010 is epic, and you know, I think people are pretty familiar with the story there, including some of the darker sides of financial practices, et cetera. But you know, in most ways, those values are sustained. There is a decline, not unsteep, but I think here things tend to happen a little later here. I think the spike was kind of still hitting in 2010 and 2011 and 12 before it declined. Generally speaking, we think of our middle neighborhoods as not being as prone to speculative value type financing that leads to those big bubbles. But here's a chart saying, that's it's a pretty dramatic change, and one you probably have trouble explaining surely through market forces. The other things that strike me here is this idea that in 1970, $50,000 worth of income bought you $55,000 worth of house, and now it gets you, somewhere north of 150, around 150 average, we could look at that as a real crisis in affordability. How much more of that income is going towards that housing than there used to be? We could also think about people's ability to build wealth. And, that happens through growth in the housing equity you have. Baltimore as a kind of legacy city, weak demand city, struggles for our residents to build wealth through housing. And in this country, that's how most of us do it. And so, we see this as a racial issue and a justice issue. So that the increase in values, we think, is a bit of a regional adjustment towards the I don't want to say the true value or the natural value exactly, but in some ways that's, I think, a good sign for us, given that buying a house on the East Coast for $150,000 should be a pretty good deal. On the other hand, the fact that so much more of your income is going into it than your previous generations had can compound the issues you face, particularly if you're carrying student debt or have other strains, which almost everybody does. Finally, and this is my favorite chart, I won't talk this much on it. The distance, even though there's only 9 of the tracks that are majority white in 2020 and whatever the number 13 that are mixed in 2020, the gap between the value of those two sets and the black middles is growing, right? And that is and the ratio between the income is means that in those neighborhoods you're building less wealth, right, in the black middle tracks. And while it might be good news on the affordability side, so that kind of goes in the column of even some of the leveling off and optimism we might feel in some of these charts is a little bit tempered, and we really are intensely curious to unpack that further and figure out what's happened since then and where things are headed.
Yeah, no, really great points. So moving on, we will look at a couple other charts. So these charts are formatted the same way, and what we are looking at on the left is home ownership rate. So as you can see, the home ownership rate for the city as a whole and for the city's middle neighborhoods has remained fairly consistent. But when we break down the middle neighborhood values, we can see that home ownership rate in white middle neighborhoods has actually declined over time, and in black middle neighborhoods that has increased over time. And then on the right side, we have a chart of vacancy rates. And so those have increased steadily over time. The one bit that kind of bucks the trend is looking at the middle neighborhoods trend going from 2010 to 2020. It declines. The vacancy rate declined in middle neighborhoods in Baltimore, which I think in general we would see as a good thing. And we see that decline in both black middle neighborhoods and white middle neighborhoods. And there are many more black middle neighborhoods and white middle neighborhoods currently. So the black middle neighborhood decline is really probably what is driving that decline in middle neighborhood vacancy rate.
Yeah, I agree that is something, and I do believe it's what we witness on the ground. In Baltimore City, there's sort of a gray area between a unit that's unoccupied and one that's pure on vacant. It doesn't really match the census interpretations of those things one-to-one, but you basically see the same trend, especially in the middle Black communities. I just also have to mention that the run-up between 90 and 2010 is absolutely alarming. You know, these are the middle neighborhoods. These are not the poorest blighted communities. And to have that level of hyper vacancy in places where, you know, there's the level of modest, but still like a lot of people are working, a lot of, you know, middle income and professionals living in these communities, and they're 20% vacant by census standards. Like, you know, this city really, for a wide variety of reasons, but, you know, suffered under a vacancy crisis. And I know some of you are from other places that share this narrative. And but in some ways, I really do take a lot of optimism from that 2020 data, and in our local administrative records of vacancy, it's continuing to decline since then. On the other hand, you know, you know, it's hard to know from a single point in time like this. Although I guess this is a 5-year ACS sweep, right? It's the 5-year survey data.
Yes, the 2010 and 2020 data are both ACS data, so they encompass 5 years.
So on the left, you know, again, somewhat optimistic, you know, the fact that the orange bar, which is more than half of the middle tracks as time goes on, and as the Black middle class communities is represented here, you know, the fact that is not declining would seem to be like, well, that looks, you know, it's hanging in there around 50. That sounds right. But again, I begin to think about which tracks are in there, and whether, because this is counter to that narrative of, you know, families with the bigger families and the families with children exiting at a greater rate than others, which you would think would lead to a decline in home ownership rate. And for me, this, I find, even though going up, you know, I'm in the home ownership business, I think that's good, but I also think we're masking churn of other tracks kind of now being counted as middle that have pretty high home ownership rates, and maybe there are some of those senior headed tracks we saw on the page chart.
Yeah, very much agreed. Moving on, and so this is the last slide of tracks, or of charts, I should say. We're looking at the same formatting as the previous charts, but on the left we have the female headed household rate by middle tract type. And so this is all census data. And so, you know, this is a pretty interesting chart. I don't think there's anything very counterintuitive to it. You know, we see that our Black middle tracts have much, much higher rates of female headed households than not only white middle tracts, but also the city as a whole. And so, you know, we have spoken a little bit about this, Bob, but I think that if we were going to look at our low income tracts, they would probably, you know, be even higher. But as it is, you know, we're not just seeing that, but we're seeing a trend of them declining. And so, you know, say what you want about, you know, family structures, but this is the data, and this is what we're seeing in the data. On the right, we're looking at the chart of poverty rate, and once again, this has remained fairly steady across time. What pops out about this to me is this persistent gap between the average poverty rate in the city as a whole and in middle neighborhoods. And we're seeing that middle neighborhoods have lower poverty rates across the board than the city as a whole. And I think that that probably speaks to what we are advocating for as a middle neighborhoods initiative, and that we think middle neighborhoods are a solution to some of these problems that we're seeing, some of these persistent problems. And even going you know, far back when middle neighborhoods were dominated by white middle neighborhoods, you see the gap. And now that middle neighborhoods are dominated by Black middle neighborhoods, you're continuing to see the gap.
Yeah, I'm not going to add a lot on this one. I would be curious to know what some of the broader trends are, like nationally with female headed households, you know, that curve here seems pretty uniform across income and race. So.
Yep, and we're taking a really narrow view here, and obviously putting some of this in context is really important. But as we move forward with this data analysis, right now we're looking at Baltimore, but we're going to look at other cities and we're going to run the same analysis, and we're going to kind of expand that. And we can think of 1,000 different ways to go with it, and really any of those ways would contribute to our knowledge base about middle neighborhoods and how to improve them. So here are some links that are useful. Bob's organization, Healthy Neighborhoods, is at healthyneighborhoods.org. This is the link to the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, which is housed by NCST. And this is a link to the data set that we use to create these charts. So I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. Raquel, did you want to move into some Q&A?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, for going over the charts. I did want folks to know, and I put in the chat, that we'll have a copy of the presentation on our website that's in the archive area of our website. I think it's incredible information to be able to continue to share, number one, and to reflect back on, especially depending on your role, meaning attendees that are joining us today, depending on their respective roles and their respective cities, how this can be helpful. So thank you very much. Let's take a look at the, it might help to, you might refer back to some of these slides. I was going to say it might be helpful to.
I can refer back to any of them. Do you want me to put the maps up to start?
Yes, please. Let's go ahead and put the maps up, and then I'll have a couple things here I want to mention to you. Some are comments, some are questions. Let's first look at, there's a question here in the Q&A from Stephen Torsell. So, is there information related to home ownership versus rental?
Yes, there is. So, like I said, this data is all pulled from census and ACS data. So there is both home ownership and rental data. We are focused on home ownership as an organization at NCST. And so we chose to kind of focus more on the home ownership data for this application. But yes, we could absolutely pull out rental data and supplement it to this data set.
And your contact information is here too. So if there's
yeah,
ways
absolutely.
that we can be helpful, yeah. Thank you for that, Chris. There is another question just came in from Eric Schertzing. What are the smaller missing middle cities that might get studied? So he's with the Michigan Land Bank Association. His wife lives in Baltimore. And so I think there's just this larger question of, how are we looking at doing some other cities as well?
Yeah, so previously we've looked at Philadelphia, and obviously that's one of the largest cities in the country. And now we've been doing Baltimore, and I think that we're going to expand to some cities in the Midwest. I think we have possibly St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit on the docket. Is that right, Raquel?
Yes, I was just thinking that, yeah.
But I think beyond that, we don't have very concrete plans. So, as projects come up, as ideas come across, I think we're really open to looking at different things. And this data set is nationwide. So we're looking very narrowly at the city of Baltimore here, but there's another project to look at what the inverse of this potentially in the suburbs of Baltimore would look like, or what some smaller cities around the country look like, and really starting to build a kind of database of what we know about middle neighborhoods over this time series. We're really interested in doing that. So I don't know exactly where we're going to go next, but we're really interested in continuing this research.
So Chris had shared the Philly data with me, and it was different enough. I would have expected it to be more the same, and it was not. They had a much steeper decline in overall count of tracks, and we're really looking at the distribution here, right? So that there's just fewer tracks near the median income and more on the edges, and the and I would also hope you do get to run some of this stuff in some of these other cities, because I think that it's pretty rich. And the fact it can go back to 1970 in a pretty normalized way And, you know, for example, we're catching the tail edge of blockbusting on this map, you know, and some of us think that's a kind of a history book thing. It's not, you know, and here it is. And, you know, we were live, some of us, for this. And, you know, I also want to drop in, I know we're going to run out of time, but there's a, you know, there's been some interventions over time in certain communities that you can pick up on this map. For those of you from Baltimore know, you know, the work that's gone on in Greenmount West or portions in the Oliver neighborhood. They start popping up as a black middle income neighborhood. It isn't necessarily how we might think of them, but that's how the data picks them up in this analysis. As well as I think on the far western edge, and the latest map, those are communities most of us think of as relatively high income. And I think they have been sucked into the middle income by virtue of the aging out of the population. So how does that inform my practice? You know, we have these senior repair programs, and I'm thinking, geez, I had been ignoring those communities. Maybe I'd better take another look. So, you know, I really was impressed with the nature of the data. And even though we kept this at a super high level, I do think there's some really some findings about where we can pitch our efforts to preserve, you know, these kinds of communities and support neighborhoods as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob. A couple comments and I think another question. So a comment from Glenn Smith, Black flight has also impacted the neighborhoods. So just more of a comment there. I don't know if you want to reflect on that, Bob, or not, but that's one comment. Another comment that came in, again, this is from Eric. Mixed as a term of art is also a survey issue. The question has been asked more and people see themselves mixed more, question mark. And I think we talked about this even when we were reviewing the data for the call, that was something that you were likely to see. So yes, on that.
Yeah, and just to comment briefly on that, Raquel, that's a really great point. You know, having familiarized myself with the data, the questions that the census and the American Community Survey have asked change every survey. So it is a challenge to match data from 1970 to data from 2019. The census didn't ask about household ethnicity in 1970. There is no data on Hispanic and non-Hispanic households because it wasn't asked until 1980. And only recently has the ACS started offering 2 or more races as an answer to the survey question in ACS surveys. So I think that's a really good point. And part of what we're picking up in these mixed tracks is an increased willingness or ability to answer those questions in a way that more accurately reflects, you know, the actual real demographics of the city.
Yeah. This comment really reminds me of sort of the policies, right? Especially around transportation, but Glenn Smith again commented, we must look at the outside influences such as the highway to nowhere in Baltimore and around the country. You know, so when we look at, you know, what are the local decisions or decision making that's taking place around transportation, this is, you know, definitely impacts how we're looking at the data and what has happened in neighborhoods as well.
Yeah, I think if you're a discerned Baltimore viewer, you can begin to feel that impacts of that particular, you know, disaster where we built this 1.25 mile long highway that dead ends on each way and relocated tens of thousands of Black families to do it. You know, there's a piece of the orange that sort of it moves to the west near the city line as you scan, and those are middle class communities. Rosemont was, and that were really devastated by that series of activities, and now they're not orange anymore, and it's because they are low income. You know, they were working class communities, mostly Black, and at this point they're not considered middle class according to this data. And you know, and as somebody said, what do you think the findings are in here? And I think that for the Black middle class neighborhoods, there's a lot of overlapping findings that are hard to sort out without more work, but there are some clear racial transitions. Was working class, was majority white, now working class, either mixed or black. Like there's plenty of those on this map that I think should feel relatively good about. But I think there's also some static related to higher income neighborhoods falling into this, and formerly middle income neighborhoods falling out, that's masked a little bit by the overall flat number. And I think that is kind of a call to action for us to really recognize the needs of those individual types of places, and they kind of have different interventions and supports and solutions that we would bring to bear on that.
Great, Bob. Thank you. Here's a question. It's interesting to see how the household income gap is increasing. This is from Cassandra Skidnoff. Do we know what's driving this in Baltimore? I think that went back to one of the latter maps or charts.
Pulling it up.
So do we know what's driving the household income gap?
Right. So you're talking about this gap between white and black neighborhoods, or the gap between middle neighborhoods and all tracts in the city? I mean, I think we had talked about this briefly, Bob, on this right-hand chart, the kind of increasing gap between income in the city as a whole and income in middle income tracts. Whereas before there really wasn't a gap, and now we're seeing that.
Yeah, and it corresponds with that millennium, like something happened after 2000. I don't have a clear understanding of why we would have seen that gap growing as a whole, and plus the sequence in 2010 was flipped, with the mixed incomes earning the most. In 2020, it's the white, even though there's only 9 tracts, it's quite a bit more. I think that 2020 number may reflect some of those remaining white tracts are going to exit north. They're going to become higher income tracts before long, and there'll be even fewer. And others the mixed income tracts are probably leveling off with the African American tracts. But I don't, other than the, sustained struggle of people to make a working wage, and to battle the chart on the left, which is more of those incomes you're going to wind up in your house. That I don't know what's driving that in a precise way.
Okay. We'll take a couple more questions before we get to the policy updates. So here is maybe a follow-up question from Cassandra. Is it a possibility to think that white poverty rate is lower because whites have relocated out of the city? We made that distinction between the city and those leaving the city. Any thoughts on that in particular, Bob?
I am sure that's true. And in fact, when you go back to the 70 charts, 1970 maps, a lot of the neighborhoods that don't show up as middle income are white, low income neighborhoods. And, we see them become middle income neighborhoods and become neighborhoods of color in one fell swoop. And it's kind of interesting in certain little segments around Southwest. And for those of you who know where Pigtown is, it's not even on the chart at all at the beginning. And then it becomes on the chart. And now it's moved through being a majority black neighborhood to a mixed neighborhood. And it's really quite a dynamic set of transitions over, this period of time.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to note that the population of the city as a whole has declined substantially over this time period as well. So I think it's declined by a third. I think it's declined from 900,000 to close to 600,000 from 1970 to 2020. And this ties back to the comment earlier about Black flight. It's not right. A lot of people have been leaving the city over this period of time.
Mm-hmm. All right, real quickly, let's see if we've got just a time for maybe 1 or 2 more. So many good ones here. Let's see. Kimberly Mitchell, please recap what was said about the wealth gap and home equity as it relates to white and black middle Black and white middle neighborhoods. I had a question about this as well, but if you can reference your thoughts again on the wealth gap and home equity. I think we're on that slide, right? In terms of the home value.
Yeah, I was trying to untangle here this drop in Black median home value and the rise in median income between 2020 and 2010 and 2020. And the fact that these Black families in 2020's houses are on median level 140, even though their incomes have gone up. Whereas it's quite a bit different story in the white and the mixed tracks, where their houses have gone up, and even the value of the houses is higher. So, I don't have anything profound about it other than to say this is, arguably people are able to build wealth as those house values go up, but it's less so in those Black neighborhoods, even though they have the income to support it. So sounds like the kind of racism to me.
And Bob, my question was a little bit on, dealing with this question as well around home values. And, we're also talking about a city that has an aging housing stock as well, right? So to the extent that, homes in certain areas needed more repair or rehab, and I don't know if you know any contextual information around this or can provide anything when you're working at the city maybe, but it's sort of like, were there incentives for homeowners to take advantage of, repair grants? And that typically is 80% or below, but I didn't know if you had any, maybe just context.
Well, those resources are in the city to some degree, and keeping in mind that our income is so much lower than the area median income, people we call middle income in the city tend to qualify for them at a cap of 80% area. I'm not, it's unclear to me whether the jump from 2000 upwards, how much of that is about the actual sustained investment and value of that home in the broader market context, and how much of that was speculative bubble. It is, the house, the figures went up from there. They all went crazy during COVID, as everyone knows, from 2020. So, I do think that there is some, again, leveling out of the marketplace. And, generally speaking, setting aside the affordability concerns and whether the equity is accessible or not, when those homes were worth $80,000, it was a very tough choice for a homeowner to put a new roof on. That was a very risky economic choice. And, generally speaking, as you saw, that abandonment rate was so high because rational economic actors were often not maintaining their properties, and they sort of slid through a series of worse and worse owners until they were empty. And in many cases, I think in our middle neighborhoods, that cycle has been pretty much interrupted. I think we're struggling to kind of catch a new wave in some places. And I think we still have kind of some drags on the overall value compared to the regional, mark that we think. But I would say in general, we're not combating like pure replacement value anymore in our middle neighborhoods. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
yeah, it helps. And I think just to also note, we had a comment here from Beverly Cree on just appraisal bias, right? So we know that that's happening in certain Black communities as well. And so just wanted to mention that we have sort of run out of time on questions, but certainly please feel free to reach out to any of us here if we can help to get you to the right folks to answer some of that, or if we can answer it here at NCST or the National Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, please let us know. But with that, a big thank you to Bob Pipik and Kristopher Hoff today for your analysis and just background and context on what we saw. There's so much more to unpack, but we certainly have run out of time today. Thanks for all the questions. I do want to, at this point, introduce again my colleague, Emmy McClintock, who's one of the policy analysts here at NCST, who's going to provide us with some updates on, if we have them, Emmy, on regulatory and legislative, both of those areas of policy. So thank you again. And Emmy, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Raquel. I'll plan to keep this pretty brief as well, but good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emmy McClintock, and like Raquel said, I work as a policy analyst here at NCST. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with my colleague, Elizabeth Coates, who normally presents on these calls, but she's out today, so I will just be providing you with some quick updates. So starting off with the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, I think many of you are probably aware by now that it was not included in the tax package that is currently pending passage, but our advocacy efforts have really not halted by any means. In the past month alone, we've been able to gain 10 additional co-sponsors in the House, and have really just continued to drive home the legislation's potential impact on different communities across the country. And with that being said, we are somewhat adjusting our internal strategy as we look towards passage in 2025. And in the meantime, we're kind of heading back to the drawing board in a way to make this legislation a little bit more politically feasible, and to also ensure that this tax credit will be workable and useful in those markets that are experiencing rising costs. Moving on quickly to our next item. NCST is excited to announce that we have officially endorsed the Preserving Homes and Communities Act. This was introduced by Senators Reed, Wyden, Smith, Brown, and Merkley a few weeks ago. Essentially, this bill is meant to strengthen the residential mortgage market, and it would require that FHA and the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, give mission-based organizations, including states and localities and nonprofits, the first shot or the first opportunity at purchasing non-performing and reperforming note sales ahead of institutional investors or private equity firms. So we're really excited to see this bill get put forward, and are really excited at the prospect of using this as a means to increase affordable and sustainable housing and homeownership. And then the last thing I'll mention, I know we are running out of time, but NCST and the Homeownership Alliance are working on drafting a comment letter in response to HUD's notice of proposed rulemaking on reforming the Community Development Block Grant Program, or the CDBG program. With this rulemaking, HUD is really looking to make it easier for recipients of the program to help promote economic development and recovery in LMI communities, and to just more broadly support investments in historically underserved areas. So with that being said, we would love to hear any thoughts that you all may have on this. And you should all feel free to reach out to Elizabeth or myself if you're interested in becoming a member of the Homeownership Alliance. And we would absolutely be happy to include any comments you may have in our final letter to HUD in early March. But with that, I'll hand it back to you, Raquel, to close us out.
I'm coming back. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Emmy. Always great information. Once again, thanks to everyone that attended today. We will make sure to have all the information up on our website so that you can refer back to it, and welcome you to join us again in March during our March Community Impact Briefing scheduled for March 20th. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.